But it's not any sort of desire to be controversial or anything like that. Because for many years in my career, my books didn't produce any controversy at all, and it was really only in the last sort of 4 or 5 years that they seem to have become more of a uh, people seem to get sort of inflamed about some of them. Pretty much starting with Jessica. I mean, I like a lot of writers, I guess. I just sort of instinctively trust myself to write the book I want to write at the time, and it's pretty much the only book I can write at that time. That this is what I need to write, and maybe the topics that have interested me the most in recent years have been those that have I guess been part of the culture wars and the ideas of what we can and cannot write about in contemporary fiction, and what publishing will accept or won't accept. And um, I wish it wasn't. In some ways, I wish it wasn't the case, because I don't actually like being seen as somebody who is out to provoke others in any way. It's not who I am as a person, or as a writer. I just really want to just tell a good story. But I do think that perhaps since Jessica was published, there does seem to be there seems to be some people out there that just doesn't matter what I do, they're just sort of like opposed to me, and like there's nothing I can do about that, really. That was very much getting that chip off my shoulder, but doing it through comedy. And I think, in regard to that, like there's not enough humor. I mean, people take everything so bloody seriously, and the demonization of people, and that if you just decide you're opposed to them, then there's some sort of like human monster. Whereas, most people are not like that at all. Most of us are just normal, regular people, like living our lives, doing our best. Um, and I think that sort of polarization is, and of course I write about it in the echo chamber, because social media does that so much, is it's so unhelpful, and it's so stupid, the way people demonize each other on there. These people would ever actually say the things they say to your face. They wouldn't come to an event I do and challenge me. They'll just sort of sit online and say nasty comments, because there's a cowardice to it as well. There's just a pure sort of infantile cowardice. Well, I think it would be very difficult to publish Striped Pyjamas today. In 2006, when I published it, there was never this question of who's allowed write what story, and you know who gives the rights to people, who allows it. Whereas now, I mean, it seems to me that people think that everything needs to be autobiography. That if it's not your story to tell, then you don't have the right to tell it. But of course, they don't turn that around on themselves at all, because by that logic, for example, a transgender writer couldn't write a novel about anybody but transgender people. A black writer couldn't write a novel about anybody but black people. It's always they never actually look at the corollary of what they're saying. Um, See, one of the things that happened with Boy in the Striped Pajamas was that when I wrote it, I wrote it as a children's book, and I wrote it as a fable. I didn't expect it to become this, massive bestseller. And when it started being taught in schools and so on, then there was eventually, when in time, within about 13, took a long time, took about 13 years before this backlash happened, where people were saying, well, you shouldn't teach this in schools, because it's a novel, it doesn't get all the facts exactly right. But what they forget is that I didn't write a school book. I wrote a novel. I didn't write it to be taught in schools. And there is this perception that I've done something wrong by that. But if teachers choose to use the book in schools, that's up to them. But I would also expect that they would have the sense to be able to point out to kids the difference between a fable and real life. And I just don't, I think now today, a person, like, if I was to come out and write that book today, I'd be inundated with sensitivity readers, and all the things that come together um, to just make a novel as bland as possible and as safe as possible. When actually, I think books, particularly books for younger readers want to be challenged. They don't want to be spoken down to and treated like they're idiots. and they're smart enough to know the difference between fiction and real life. And in terms of a backlash against all the broken places, well, when it was announced, certainly there was, the usual suspects online who hadn't read the book and had no intention of reading the book, already complaining about the existence of the book. And for me, I mean, I don't understand the mindset of that. If you don't want to read the book, listen, you go into a bookshop, there's more books than any of us could ever get through in our lifetimes. Don't read it. I think if every time somebody spent tweeting about a book that they don't like, if they spent tweeting about a book they did like, then maybe, they'd be putting something more positive into the world. So I can't control any backlashes. I can't control any of that. The reviews here were really good. The book spent 6 months in the top 10. I'm very, very happy with it as a novel. And I think ultimately it's not what happens right now. It's what happens sort of in 50 years' time with books, that there'll be books that are remembered and books that are forgotten. And I'm pretty sure Boy in the Striped Pyjamas is one of those that will be remembered, and All the Broken Places alongside it. It's usually really just about the central character. That in the 6 books I've written for young people, that I call for young people, they've got an 8 or 9-year-old kid at the center of them, and the adult novels always have an adult. But other than that, I don't do a lot of. I write them in the same way. I don't make the language any simpler in the young people's books. I don't make the themes any simpler. They're just kind of shorter. But I knew with this when I started thinking about this book many years ago, and I knew I wanted to almost for it to balance Striped Pyjamas in the sense that the first one is from the point of view of this very naive child, and the second one is from the point of view of a very wise elderly lady, and my age is actually halfway between the two, between the 9 and the 91, and I thought it would be a very interesting thing to kind of see this story and the history of what happened during those times from the complete polar opposite of who Bruno was in the first book, and look at it from Gretel's perspective. I also kind of like the idea. I couldn't really think of a young person's book that had a sequel by the same author that was then written for an adult audience. And I thought it was kind of just a nice, kind of interesting literary thing to do. I think the whole point of literature in a way is to kind of find the stories that haven't been written, and to write them and to find interesting characters. And in many ways, if I had written a book from the perspective of a Jewish character in a camp, or a Jewish character who had survived the Holocaust, I could understand maybe people saying, well, you shouldn't write that. You haven't had that experience. But writing about German characters during that time, and their experience of the war, and how it affects the national psyche for the decades going forward. And I've got German friends who I've talked to about this, and it's obviously a very complicated thing for the national psyche. I think that's a story worth telling, and it doesn't mean that I'm ignoring the stories of the real victims at all. It's just telling more stories, and we are told that we should kind of keep the Holocaust alive, keep writing about it, keep talking about it, and if that means telling some stories from different perspectives, well, I think that's a good thing. I think as long as you try, as long as you aim to do it respectfully and in an interesting way, and my critics might say, well, they're terrible books, whatever. Okay, but as long as your goal is to is you set out to do it in an honest and respectful way, I think that's a good thing. I met over the years of my travels with Striped Pyjamas. I met a lot of Jewish people, obviously, when I was doing talks, and I did meet people whose fathers maybe had worked in camps or had been in the Wehrmacht or something, and who were interested in the subject and would come along and come to the talks. And I always I always wanted to hear their stories too. Originally this all started for me as a teenager because I was just very, very interested in the Holocaust and wanting to learn more about it. And all these years later, I'm still trying to learn more about it and trying to understand it better. So anybody who tells me their story and has an interesting perspective and something new, that's just something that I, not as a writer, just as a just as a human, I'm just interested in and I want to know more about. I don't want to be sort of like the grumpy middle-aged man criticizing everybody all the time, but what I do worry about sometimes when I read novels by people in their late 20s or early 30s is how safe they are, and how they're sort of ticking all the boxes in each one, and that then the work to me then seems to lack authenticity, and it lacks kind of a real sense of a writer's voice. I think I think we have to be brave in our storytelling, and not just write things because we know this is might get us into the industry, this might get us published. You've got to want to write something that actually challenges in some way. I think a writer who goes through their entire career without causing any controversy, you know, is maybe kind of a bit boring. As I say, I don't say you shouldn't set out to do it, but you should be challenging the reader in some way, and not writing these very, very safe books. I'm not a fan of sensitivity readers. I am a fan of listening to my editor and being told, is this working? Is this? But I'm not a fan of being told that this might offend somebody. If it offends somebody, then just don't read it. I don't read writers who I know, whose work I know I just don't enjoy, or perhaps whose public persona annoys me in some way. As I say, there's plenty to read out there. But I do think younger writers should be a little more brave, perhaps, in their fiction, and stop writing the same book over and over, and kind of cover versions of each other's novels. Last week, when Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and she's pulled her new novel, as far as I understand it, because it's set in Russia, because that would be insensitive to Ukrainians. And it just baffles me. I mean, she presumably has spent a couple of years writing the novel. There's like just because it's set in Russia, there's plenty of decent Russian people, I'm sure. They're not all Putin. It seems to me an extraordinary act of virtue signaling to suddenly spend all that time writing 100,000 words or something, and then say, "But I'm not going to publish it because it might upset somebody."